Today, we're tackling one of the most defining and divisive questions of our time: who gets to belong in Britain? As Tanjil Rashid, the New Statesman culture editor, writes for this week's cover story, we are no longer in an age of migration. We have been propelled into something altogether new, an age of deportation. Tanjil joins me now.
Hello.
Tanjil, you begin the piece with quite an extraordinary and touching anecdote. I wondered if you could start by just sharing that with listeners.
Yeah, it was a strange and beautiful moment, actually, that's always stayed with me. I was cycling through East London one day, where my family lives, a place called Ilford, and I was cycling through and my tyre punctured and I had to, abandon ship, and I parked my bike, locked it on a very quiet residential street, left it there, went about my business, came back, and the front wheel was missing. And I was sort of standing there just sort of cursing because, well, anyone who's a cyclist in London knows that these things happen, and your assumption would be someone's nicked part of your bike. And I was standing there sort of, really angry, cursing sort of our crime-ridden streets. And then a door opened behind me and a man was standing there and he said, "Don't worry." And in his hand was my front wheel, which he'd taken upon himself to repair. He'd sort of just seen that the tyre was punctured, so he just sort of removed the wheel, fixed the puncture, and he sort of reassembled my bike, and we got talking, and it turned out that he was an asylum seeker in just one of these Home Office properties that the Home Office actually have everywhere, and this was just in a random street in Ilford. And it turned out he was from Eritrea. Now, you hear a lot about Eritrea now. I didn't realise that it's a country, there's an awful government there. It's a tiny country, but it's the second most common source for illegal migrants, because the government there basically just, under the guise of conscription, just sort of enlists men and uses them as forced labour, and so they flee. So that's why there are so many coming on boats, and he was one of them. And we got talking. Lovely man. He loved bicycles. It turned out that Asmara, the capital city of Eritrea, is really famous for bicycles. There's a BBC article I read afterwards that said that Asmara is cycling heaven, and he just loved bikes, and he just loved repairing them. He also liked fixing things in general. He would fix cars, washing machines, televisions. He was, in many ways, a really upstanding member of his community. I mean, he wasn't someone who was undermining social cohesion. Far from it. He was really the very model of social cohesion in a way. So, yeah, I opened the article with that anecdote because I just felt the need to show that these people are not just, horrible, violent criminals and, sex pests. That's the tabloid language around around asylum seekers.
Predators, and I think, how are the Reform describing asylum seekers today? Fighting age males.
Fighting age males, as if they've come here to invade. And they use this language. They talk about the arrivals as akin to the D-Day invasions. And that kind of language really appalls me. And I felt that, I just needed to share this story, which I've just sort of been sitting on for years, actually.
Yeah, I think what's important about that anecdote, Tanjil, is not just that it's a nice anecdote that shows you, a kind person that goes against this notion that we have now of fighting age males and sexual predators and the kind of scenes that we see at the Epping Hotel and all of that. But it's emblematic for you of the problems with the wider debate and how quickly it is shifting. And that is the point that you get at, I think, brilliantly in your piece, that what we're seeing here is not simply a question anymore of deportation, the practicalities of deportation, of deporting asylum seekers or illegal immigrants who have arrived in Britain and have had their claims rejected. and are to be removed. We're talking about something that's becoming far more radical, which is the idea of mass deportation, mass expulsion, and what you think that means when it is put into practice, which is a questioning and an undermining of what it means to be British.
That's right. I mean, I think, there's this idea that the proposals for mass deportation is, it's just a solution, a practical solution to a problem that we have in excessive levels of illegal migrant arrivals. But the truth is that actually it is linked to a much more dangerous rhetoric, which is about reshaping what Britain means. Mm-hmm. It isn't just about this problem of illegal migration. It's about deciding who gets to be British. Because when Reform talks about their proposals for mass deportation, they're also demonizing the individuals. We've talked about them being described as fighting age males. They're spoken of as people who hate this country. Mm-hmm. It's not just that we can't cope, so we need to reduce the levels. These people are being portrayed as an invasion of enemies who hate this country, and that's just not true. I mean, that's why I use this example of this lovely bloke from Eritrea. Who obviously doesn't hate this country, a reasonable debate can be had about like what levels we can cope with, but once you start claiming that this country is only for those who are already here and not just who are already here who have ancestry here, and we are incapable of allowing the entry of people from different backgrounds, which is what this is really about. Mm-hmm. It's about preserving Britain. And, the politicians on the right don't deny this anymore. They're quite open about the fact that they think Britain is being irretrievably lost mm-hmm. because of high levels of immigration, because essentially foreigners are coming in and polluting the country.
Yeah, and I think this is where your piece is so important, and I think original. And I urge listeners to read it in this week's magazine. Is that you focus on some of the absolute fundamentals in this debate with an honesty that I think is important here. And so one of the points that you get at is how quickly things have radicalized. So we don't have to go back very far, of course, into what feels like an entirely different world where we had a kind of David Cameron premiership and a very different type of Conservative Party that was in power with the Liberal Democrats. We're now into a world where the Conservative Party is far behind Reform in the polls, and it's not just Reform that are driving the agenda, but individuals to the right of Reform. And we have a Conservative Party that is, in some senses, again, further to the right of Nigel Farage. So you give an example here about 1 year ago, Reform was aiming to moderate its image. And you quote Nigel Farage saying, "It's a political impossibility to deport hundreds of thousands of people." And he is making that point in response to Rupert Lowe, then a member of his party who is expelled for being too extreme. And I think that's an interesting quote from Farage, because he's saying it's not that it's wrong. He's saying it's a political impossibility. Like, I can't do it. And he is expelling Rupert Lowe from the party for pushing that argument. But we now have a world in which, as you set out quite clearly, Rupert Lowe is driving the agenda. And we have people like Douglas Carswell, who were once seen as moderate, indeed modernising figures within the Conservative Party, talking about from the river to the sea, Britain will effectively be Muslim-free, is what he is writing.
From Epping to the sea, let's make Britain Abdul-free, as in free of Muslims. And this is Douglas Carswell, who was actually regarded as, being one of the liberal moderating figures in the erstwhile UKIP party. But do go on.
Yeah, absolutely. But we also have what I think is, you can see is a creeping use of or a fixation on white British as well. So that has become an important sort of measure for those on the right. How do we protect Britain or parts of Britain being majority white British. Now that again, that is a subtle sign of a shifting Overton window, as you put it in the piece. But it's important, isn't it, because of what it says about ideas of homeland and protection, as the right see it, protecting something before it is lost, and that is the sense that you get out very powerfully in this piece.
That's right, and I think it's really incredible the shift that we've seen. Simply in the last year, also, in the bigger picture in recent years. I mean, the kind of stuff that is being said within the Conservative Party now was taboo, even as recently as, let's say, the Theresa May prime ministership.
The Sunak premiership.
The Sunak premiership, yeah. And also within Reform, or within Nigel Farage's party, as you say, I mean, Rupert Lowe was expelled from the party in some kind of power struggle in which one of the disputes was Rupert Lowe's seeming extremism, because he was really banging the drum over the deportation of members of Britain's Pakistani community who were linked to the horrible grooming gang sort of crimes that were perpetrated by some Pakistanis. And Lowe was of the view that basically anyone linked to those crimes, and he didn't seem to be particularly rigorous about determining how linked, should just be deported. And even if they were citizens of the UK or born here, his view was that essentially they have this other nationality. They're essentially Pakistanis, and they can just be legitimately booted over there. No matter how many. I mean, he was talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions at times. He was talking about, if we need, not just to do with the Pakistani community, if we need to deport millions, we should just do it. Now, Nigel Farage, little over a year ago, was distancing himself, as you say, from that kind of rhetoric. He said, as you quoted him, that it was a political impossibility to deport hundreds of thousands of people. Now, that's what we've been talking about in the last week or so, deporting hundreds of thousands of people as proposed by Reform. So the Overton window has definitely shifted, and the Conservatives have gone with them. The shift to the Conservative Party is really interesting because, Robert Jenrick is now positioning himself as someone, who's very hardline. And not long ago, he himself, there are videos of him, which have actually been shared by Reform for obvious reasons, of Jenrick saying, Britain is a country of immigrants, and that he too was probably of immigrant stock, and he was proud of that. Mm-hmm. And that's what Britain's all about. All of that sort of liberal Cameroon conservative rhetoric, which has now just gone completely out the window. Because, under Kemi Badenoch, the Conservatives are trying to say, actually, we'll be more hardline than Reform. We'll deport even women and children back to Afghanistan because Reform was saying that, they wouldn't do that. They're at least compassionate enough not to do that. So they're all competing to outdo each other in a kind of rhetoric that was itself taboo, not just within my living memory. I mean, like, just the other day almost.
Yeah. And that's what's so fascinating. And I think where we are now is trying to measure where, if at all, a Rubicon exists now in British politics. And what is that, and has it been crossed? Because what we're talking about, in a sense, then, is the deportations of those who arrived illegally in Britain and are deemed to not have the right to live here. Now, that is Labour Party policy, right? That is the Labour government's policy, and they are doing it. But as you put it, they are doing it at a scale of, I think it's 20,000 from memory from your piece.
Since the election, I believe the correct figure is 20,000 removals. This is the word that's used, but the language that's used in officialdom. That there have been about 20,000 removals. And
now we're talking about a number of 600,000 under the Conservative and Reform rhetoric. But what is important here, isn't it, that a distinction is now being made by Lowe and by Carswell and by others that goes way beyond that into a realm that, as you put it in your piece, questions the very notion of what it means to be England, and crucially, who gets to decide? Who has the power to decide that? Because what Lowe is questioning is the very notion that people who are born here with passports, with citizenship, are as English as somebody else and can therefore be deported on his decision or on the decision of a government. And that is the very, very clear implication of Douglas Carswell and what he is saying. That, I think, is a whether the Rubicon may be way further back. We may have crossed it, months ago in this distinction between removals of those who have arrived illegally and mass deportations of those who are here. I mean, go back to Boris Johnson as mayor of London, and he was advocating for an amnesty for illegal immigrants as part of his sort of liberal mayoralty. So we may have crossed the Rubicon, months ago, but I think this is a new one and a very scary one in a sense, because it is saying, even if you are British legally, there is now, or potentially there is a question mark over it. And I think that's where your piece becomes really powerful, because you make both a kind of personal and a kind of historical case about how radical that is.
Yeah, that's right. I think you're right to point out these different Rubicons, because let's say one of them is this idea of the numbers. You're quite right. We move from this idea of a potential amnesty, and then we're ramping up the numbers, tens of thousands, and then we're quite seriously entertaining that the most likely next government is talking about 600,000 within their first parliament. So that is a huge line that's been crossed. Like, no one was ever talking about that before, and as we said, Reform was saying that wasn't even possible. Then the other thing is about how deportation is going to be used as a tool to reshape who gets to be British. Now, Reform would say that their plans are simply about illegal immigrants. They've said nothing about, stripping ethnic minorities of their citizenship and getting rid of them. And indeed, Zia Yusuf, the front man for these policies, is himself of immigrant heritage, which, obviously rhetorically and in terms of the optics, plays very well. And is, I must admit, a little bit reassuring, because you think he's not exactly going to deport his own family members, is he? But it is very, very murky, because Reform are making this case in a rhetorical ecosystem that is actually talking about deporting people who are British and British born just because they're an ethnic minority. I mean, they're playing to a gallery that consists of types like this, and Douglas Carswell is a very good example. Now, Carswell has been using some very, very horrible language, and he has openly admitted that he just wants to deport Muslims. Mm-hmm. That he said this. He's tweeted that he thinks we need to get rid of Muslims
from his new home in Mississippi.
From his new home in Mississippi, he's found a sort of renewed patriotism, and thinks that we need. Now, why is that relevant? Because Douglas Carswell is actually, in some ways, I would argue, one of the architects of Reform's policy. He published in the Telegraph a long basically this treatise outlining how to deport people. Well, that was one of the pillars of this article about saving Britain. And he uses the term remigration, which is a term that's used by the European far right. And the 600,000 figure that Reform are using, now I can't prove it, but it must be connected to, in some way, to what Douglas Carswell says, because he also uses a same or similar figure. So, they're clearly working within the same kind of framework. Now, Carswell isn't officially a member of Reform, and I don't know what his, if he has any links, probably nothing.
Well, Carswell and Farage famously hate each other and fell out because, hilariously now, Carswell was seen as a modernising tool to make Farage look more moderate when in order to achieve Brexit.
Yeah. But their careers are sort of interestingly linked, and they're linked in the sense that, Carswell has been having a jubilant couple of days. I mean, he's been sort of on a mad one basically since Reform announced these policies, and he's been sort of kind of triumphantly sort of tweeting about deportations and this and that and this horrible slogan that I don't even want to repeat, so these people are very, very excited by what Reform are suggesting, by this changed conversation in which people are talking about deporting 600,000 people. Horrible racists are really excited about this. Now, yes, it's true. Reform haven't yet said anything explicitly racist, but this is what I'm talking about. Like, that's the direction of travel that we might be headed in. I think we are headed in. And when you look at the interplay between these different ideas, now politicians are very, very careful about that and what you can pin to them.
So Tanjil, in your piece, you write that Britain has always been or had a composite identity shaped by empire and migration, and the very birth of Britain as a nation with multiple nations within it is something different to a lot of other national identities and histories. How does that history sit within what we're talking about, these ideas of kind of resurgent English nationalism and the ideas of home and what it means to be a kind of true Englishman?
Enoch Powell is in many ways the intellectual, ideological godfather of the Age of Deportation. I mean, he was the first person to propose and theorize the mass deportation of people from Britain, which at the time he used the term repatriation, which was the term in currency then.
Voluntary
repatriation, because Powell didn't cross the taboo of thinking that people should be forced to leave.
Can I add an interesting point on that? And what Powell's defence was always that he was espousing official Conservative Party policy at the time. Now, I think that's both he has slightly overplayed his hand there, and he knows very well what he was doing. But it does contain an important truth, and that itself is important to note here, that there was a Conservative Party policy that then was enacted in government, in legislation, that meant that the UK government would help with the costs of, in quotes, voluntary repatriation. So the sort of the depths of Powell's influence and the racism was made kind of official in British history, and we're not talking about that long ago. I think that sort of these are important points just to stress to listeners in terms of how the rhetoric can lead into official government policy.
Yeah, and you're referring, of course, to the Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, after which he was sacked, and there was a whole furore and basically a sort of national uprising, at least in some quarters, of people rising up in support of Powell, who had been sacked by the Conservatives. I guess it was about tone, right? And I think a lot of these questions are about tone. I think the tone really disgusted the mainstream of the Conservative Party, and they felt they had to part ways with Powell. Now, Powell is interesting, as I say, because he is the intellectual godfather to Rupert Lowe, Nigel Farage, Reform. He's widely respected, widely read, widely quoted. And Powell essentially believed that England was not a composite identity, that it had been, and that this was a mistake, that England had been corrupted by its experience in the wider world through empire, and that English nationalism needed to be revived. He felt that it was this older cosmopolitan imperial idea of Britain that had led to the calamity of migration, or that was connected at least to the calamity of migration. And he thought that, essentially a kind of purer English nation. I'm not sure he used the word pure, but he thought that immigrants of what he would call coloured immigrants, which was the term he used and that was fashionable at the time, were essentially corrupting this pure idea of England. And that essentially is the lingering ideological background to the Age of Deportation. in my opinion. It is about moving, as Powell wanted to, away from this broad-minded idea of Britishness, which was equated with Englishness, that England and Britain were both composite identities. Britain in particular was a composite identity because it was basically invented in 1707 after the Act of Union, when two different nations, England and Scotland, were brought together in a union. A new identity, Britain, was created that would encompass the Scots, the English, not only that, the Welsh, the Irish, and eventually also all the various nations that would be encompassed and invented by the British Empire, everything from Australians to Indians. And this was, has for a few centuries essentially been the idea of Britain.
The idea is contained within not just Rivers of Blood, but what you're referring to, the sort of the speeches that predate that and then go on into the 70s. Enoch Powell speeches are kind of these fantastical accounts of English history, and they contain so many contradictions, and the contradictions themselves we could have a debate about, over a podcast, or have a discussion about. And this idea that, England and Britain, England and the United Kingdom, how do they interact with each other? Powell became an MP for in a Northern Irish seat, and he's eulogizing England as this this place of continuity, deep continuity, without sort of focusing on the contradictions at the heart of that, the composite identity that is Britain, that is the United Kingdom, but also, of course, his deep imperialism that he felt so strongly up until the point at which India gained independence. This is when India gained independence, he walks the streets of London in a daze because he is so shocked and upset because he wanted to become viceroy of India. Now, I think he then makes this case, and I think you have made the case to me, Tanjil, I'd love to hear it very briefly, that in a sense, Powell becomes this post-colonial radical. And that is a way to understand him. And that is still a way to understand Britain, in a sense, as a kind of post-colonial country. Just because it's the kind of imperial centre doesn't mean that we can't apply the same lens through that, because Powell turns against imperialism and turns even against the remnants of imperialism, like the Commonwealth, and says that's just a sham. It's not real. You need to rebuild England as the nation at the heart of the empire. And I think this is the point where we have to stress to listeners that there was still this idea of a global Britain, in which you had Australian prime ministers in the 50s talking about themselves as British to my bootstraps, and New Zealand prime ministers talking about it in the same way. Edmund Hillary climbed Everest and planted a Union flag and the New Zealand prime minister said he was proud an Englishman had climbed Everest, and he was a Kiwi. Yeah. So you had this global Britain, and then you had this figure who had been a representative of global Britain, who wanted to reach its pinnacle as the sort of viceroy of India, and then rejects it all because it's the reaction to the loss of empire, in a sense.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, another example that I quite like is the left-wing Marxist intellectual giant C.L.R. James from the Caribbean, mm-hmm. who called himself a British intellectual. Mm-hmm. He wrote a book called British Civilization. Mm-hmm. He always identified very strongly as British before he'd even stepped foot in Britain.
Yeah, because that was correct at the time.
And that was correct. Even after these countries had become independent, they still thought of themselves, many of them, as British. You're right. That falls apart. In this post-colonial moment, that all falls apart, and essentially we move from this sort of grand ideal of Britain to this idea of England. And Powell epitomizes that shift. He basically goes from being British to being to a believer in this grand ideal of Britain to this quite narrow idea of England. Some might call it this sort of Little Englander perspective.
Should we read from one of the quotes that you from his? It's the St. George Day speech that he gives. I think as it's in 62, and you quote it in your piece. 61. Tell us what it is that binds us together, Powell says, and he is urging here a sort of retelling of histories, and he's asking, when he says tell us, he's asking these sort of very old English ancestors, sort of pre-imperial England, to tell us what it is that bound them together in the sort of old England. Show us the clue that leads through 1,000 years, the unity of England, effortless and unconstrained, the homogeneity of England so profound and embracing that the counties and regions make it a hobby to discover their differences and assert their peculiarities. I mean, this is obviously kind of absurdly romantic stuff that beyond the imperial history, that was just, he recasts it as a kind of a folly, a mistake, and actually it did nothing to affect England. England remained just as it was beforehand. We don't need to worry about empire. That was just a brief adventure in 1,000 years. And if you cast back, we were just this perfectly unified country since 1066.
Yeah, and in fact, there's another section in that speech which is so interesting in terms of what it reveals about how Powell eventually came to see empire. And that's the bit in the speech where he compares the post-colonial English to Athenians recovering from the occupation of the Persian Empire, as if basically the English themselves had been colonized by Britain or by the British Empire. That's essentially what he's saying. So we today, he began, at the heart of a vanished empire, amid the fragments of demolished glory, seem to find, like one of her own oak trees standing and growing, the sap still rising from her ancient roots to meet the spring, England herself. Now, Powell was a very competent poet and a very accomplished classicist, and you can tell. But it's very revealing. I mean, he thinks the English had been colonized by themselves, by the British Empire.
An idea as well.
Yeah, by an idea of, and that's the idea. Why does this all matter? Why are we talking about this?
Yeah,
that's the idea of Britain and of England that I grew up with. That generations of English people have grown up with.
not the Powellite idea, the other idea.
The other idea,
Exactly,
idea that Powell was rejecting.
Yeah,
With some psychological torment that Powell was rejecting. That's an England that is not a little island, but a grand confluence where seemingly all the world passed through it in some way. That the history is entwined with the rest of the world. There's that famous question of Kipling's. What should they know of England who only England know? I mean, the idea is that you can't really be English unless you have been embroiled in something bigger than England, and that's what immigration is. That's what it's all about, really. I don't think of immigration as many liberals actually see it, which is just it's just a practical thing. We need immigrants. I mean that's true.
It's not just an economic factor, as if the economics changed, we wouldn't need it. We could just change the formula.
It has arisen from a very powerful history that goes to the very origin of Britain as a composite nation that could encompass, multiple home nations that originally were just the English and the Scottish, and then progressively got bigger, the Irish, the Indians, various Africans, West Indians, Malays, all sorts, Native Americans, in Canada and so on, all became British. And although we did decolonize most of the world, that idea stayed with us, that Britain is something big and grand and tolerant and inclusive and capacious. And Powell couldn't stand it, and Powell's heirs on the right can't stand it. They want to recover this England that they feel has been wrecked by foreigners who they consider to be outside English history. I mean, and I would contend that's not true. That that there is a deep history here that is being denied.
Well, they're completely confused on this point, because for most of this sort of post-war history, Powell stood outside of a lot of the mainstream, not just in British politics, but in the conservative mainstream, because he would question things like the Commonwealth, as I mentioned, dismissing it as a sham. Now, this is at a time when most of the conservative right would have held up the Commonwealth as, kith and kin compared to the Europeans, who, of course, were really foreign. And we should, and that idea has stayed with British politics to this day, where you will hear that sense that we should move away from Europe towards the Commonwealth because we have deeper ties with them. But of course, when that interacts with any sense of ties moving both ways, any sense that we genuinely are kith and kin with countries that are non-white beyond our borders, then that starts to break down. And I think it's interesting to note that it's broken down from the beginning, in a sense. You could go to the Versailles Conference, for example, and you can see the seating arrangements where you would have Lloyd George and the Dominion prime ministers would be given a certain seat and a certain prominence, the Canadians, the New Zealanders, the South Africans, and the Australians, but not the Indians.
Yeah,
they're considered slightly lesser.
Yeah,
so it's further away. But I think you have the unpicking of that idea through Powell and his speeches, but also through acts of government. And this brings us back, I think, to your piece and the importance here, and why we should really stress the importance and the interplay between the rhetoric and power of the state. In that, the idea of Britain as a sort of the great global confluence was unpicked in various acts of parliament over immigration. I can't remember all of the dates now, but I think there were 48, 68, 71 were big acts of parliament that restricted the rights. And they restricted it in ways that were racialised. It was 68 in particular, the Act of 68 under a Labour government, and in 71 under Ted Heath's government. They restricted the right to enter Britain from the former empire to those that were considered patriots, so those whose parents or grandparents were born in Britain. Now, that was a bureaucratic way of essentially saying, are you white?
Yeah.
If you have a British grandparent, you were almost certainly, British-born grandparent, you were almost certainly white. So it removed the rights of those in Africa or the subcontinent to come to Britain. And that was an act of state power. Now, that is where we project forward now into a future.
Yeah, because the age of deportation is long in the making, right? And there's a future here. I mean, we're not, in some ways, we're not there yet in terms of what I talk about in the piece. I'm talking about the future in many ways. I don't talk so much about the past, but those are really interesting dates, because 1948, that's the year after Indian and Pakistani independence, and you have this act which basically formalizes this idea that everyone in the former colonies are still British. Like, you would, even though you might be an Indian citizen or Pakistani citizen, you had the right to come to Britain. And that is how many members of my family originally came to Britain, and how the Windrush generation, which I do talk about in the piece, came to Britain, because they were considered British in law. Yeah. And that was a retention of the old idea of Britain as this grand cosmopolitan composite nation that Powell at the time was still kind of on board with, around kind of.
He was starting to break with it, because he came to see that as the kind of the original sin, didn't he?
Yeah. And then we go, that's almost 100 years ago now, actually. It's, and, we've gone from that moment to this moment where we've not only whittled away all of those rights, you mentioned 68, 71 and more since, so now you can't just come to Britain if you're, from a former colony.
There are echoes, though, if you think about Hong Kong under the Boris Johnson government.
There's still remnants, you're right. But now, not only have we, we've removed those rights, we're now removing those rights that were established through international conventions, like the 1951 Convention on Refugees, where it's proposed that Britain will remove the Human Rights Act, which is obviously much more recent. But a lot of this, basically, the legal framework through which so many people came to this inclusive Britain, this haven that Britain was, is being removed slowly. I mean, and that's what deportation is really about. It is about sort of completely overturning this inclusive Britain and turning it into an exclusive one.
Yeah, and I think we should draw the episode to a close here. I mean, there's so much for us to talk about in the future, Tanjil, and we should return to many of these questions. And unfortunately, I think we will have to by the nature of the news. But we should return to these questions of British history as well. But what strikes me is that we've lived through various sort of phases of post-war Britain, and part of that is a kind of post-imperial Britain and a reckoning there, and how you transform yourself from an imperial power into a post-imperial power. And essentially what Britain did was it shedded layer upon layer of those obligations and duties and ties, in successive steps, as we've said, 48, 68, 71, the other acts. And not all of those obligations have been completely shedded. So we still see them with Hong Kong, as we just discussed. But then we created a new Britain with the accession into Europe and the immigration that came with that and the obligations that came with that. And now we're living through this kind of post-European, post-imperial Britain into a new world, a kind of globalized world, where and perhaps a post-rules-based order world, where not just Britain, but plenty of countries are shedding their obligations to international legal system, duties, rights, and all of that. And so that is the world now that we're entering, and it's not quite clear. And in your piece, you talk about not just Britain. You say how it's happening in India with the Bengalis, and you talk about how it's happening in the United States with Trump and the and of course what is happening in Israel and Gaza. We're talking about something that is happening across Europe and the world now, an age of deportation. And that's why the sort of that phrase that you use in the piece to me is so powerful, and why we've led the magazine with it this week.
That's right. It is absolutely a global phenomenon. There's something of a paradox here, that these forms of nationalism are not limited to the nations concerned, but actually all over the world, these nations are echoing each other and basically flying headlong into this age of deportation, in which basically lots and lots of people are going to be made stateless. Lots and lots of people are going to be deported. I don't foresee ever anything like what's happening in Gaza happening in Britain, but we are part of this same ecosystem in which the post-World War II rules-based order, which was in many ways the creation of empires that were still existent at the time these laws and conventions were being made, are all unraveling. And the overturning of the disapplying, as Reform puts it, of these laws and conventions in the UK is of a piece with the way Israel is completely disregarding international law. And these things are not just connected theoretically, because the disregard and flagrant contravention of international law by countries like Israel is creating stateless people, is creating refugees, and those people very soon, people from Gaza, will be on boats off the coast of Dover. So these things are completely connected, and the solution is not for every little country just to go its own way and completely overturn these laws that uphold an ideal of civilization and of peace. The solution is not to just overturn all of these, because that's not solving anything. The way is to double down on them. I strongly believe that we need to reinforce international law so that these wars stop, so that human rights are respected, and we don't have the persecution that leads to the migration crisis, and that we don't have the wars that lead to the migration crisis. All of these things that lead to the migration crisis, international law is a way of of stopping that, of maintaining, a peaceful world, or at least trying our best to achieve it.
Well, thanks, Tanjil. We should leave it there on that. Is it a hopeful note? I hope it's a hopeful note. To read Tanjil's cover story in full, you really should head to the website now via the link in the show notes, or pick up a copy of the New Statesman on newsstands from Friday.